A master opus up on the website BloombergPolitics.com right now. It's about Hillary Clinton's Nixonian roots. Sam, welcome. Tell people who don't know about the historical connection how Hillary Clinton got all tied up with Nixon.
Her introduction to American politics, to Beltway politics. We're not talking about working on campaigns and all the children's defense crusades, all that great stuff she did. Her first picture of politics was when she was on the Judiciary Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, that drew up the articles of impeachment for Richard Nixon in 1974. She worked for a guy named John Doerr, vanishing species of a great liberal Republican who wanted a totally above board, right, investigation, examination. Hillary was there in the spring and summer 1974, 1 year out of law school, helping draw up the articles of impeachment.
So you go further, though, than saying that there's a historical connection and that this was her entrance into politics. You then go on to say that she is now Nixon's heir.
Yeah.
In what ways?
Well, she's Nixon's ideological, or not so much ideological as strategic daughter. If I were Aaron Sorkin, you had great Jay Roach, if I were Aaron Sorkin doing my Hillary Clinton biopic, I start with her in that windowless room in the old Capitol Hotel across the street from Congress with headphones on, and she's one of the first people on the planet to hear Nixon's tapes. And the one tape she listened to most closely was his defense in case he actually was impeached, how he was going to make the case that what he'd done was okay. So she does that. You stop and you wind the clock back to 1972, when Hillary and her boyfriend, Bill Clinton, are in Texas trying to get a great idealist, George McGovern, elected president. And they know he's not going to win, but they can't believe how he got crushed. They worked in Texas. In Texas, Nixon got 67% of the vote. Nobody does that anymore, guys. Nixon got 60% of the vote nationally. He won 49 out of 50 states. And Hillary says, Bill and I had a lot to learn about how you run a campaign. So if you're Hillary Clinton, doesn't mean she wants to be Nixon.
Right.
She's taken inside the mind of Richard.
What has she said or written about Nixon since those days?
She said a few things about it. One is that one of her most memorable moments was hearing that one tape, what she called the tape of tapes, in which Nixon extenuates. Hillary, we learned a couple of weeks ago, is a brilliant political witness. Nixon wasn't, right? Hillary actually believes what she says, and most of the time, some of us will say, we think she's right, right? So one thing she learned from him was that, but there was a second thing. She had another job for John Doerr on the Watergate committee. That was to write up a memo that showed the blueprint of how Nixon's White House worked.
I want to ask you a question that's not about. I want to ask you a question that's not about this piece. You have something interesting to say. You're talking about this new book, the John Meacham book that's come out on 41. Talk about what you think is going on with that book and the relationship between Poppy Bush, and his son. George.
Well, since we're putting everybody on the couch and the Bushes don't like to be there, here's my thought. If you read W's book, which is actually pretty good, 41, this loving memoir of his father, you read it closely, he takes his father apart as a political figure. He describes someone who got ahead through family connections on Wall Street, even when he describes his father out in Texas. Well, when Dad needed money, he came back to New York, he went to Connecticut, he went to Washington, where the money was. He describes his father's political career as having been a series of patronage jobs, which is true. Right, he ran the Republican National Committee. He had an ambassador's job in China. They gave him the CIA. The job his father wanted was to be vice president, right? And he lost out to Nelson Rockefeller. Then at the end of the book, W says, when I was trying to put together my team, I called Dad and I said, what do you think about Dick Cheney as vice president? And his father said, great choice, son. He's loyal and will never stab you in the back.
While Clinton continues to blame her email scandal on Republicans playing politics, the man who is perhaps the most venerated political journalist of our time is likening her situation to the epic Washington scandal he helped uncover. Tonight, Chief Washington correspondent and Watergate historian James Rosen reports on Bob Woodward's comparison of Emailgate and Watergate.
As president, Richard Nixon recorded 3,700 hours of tapes, of which 18.5 minutes, less than 1% of the total, were erased by a culprit never identified. As Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton sent or received on her private server 63,000 emails, of which she tells us she herself erased 30,000, nearly half the total. The comparisons come now from individuals not typically associated with vast right-wing conspiracies.
You've got a massive amount of data. It, in a way, reminds me of the Nixon tapes, thousands of hours of secretly recorded conversations that Nixon thought were exclusively his.
It's an interesting analogy because President Nixon acted as if he was never in trouble. He was never going to be investigated. He was never going to be caught. And oh, P.S., those tapes, they belong to me. They don't belong to the government. Does that sound familiar?
As a young lawyer, Clinton served on the House Judiciary Committee that recommended the impeachment of President Nixon. Clinton has written about listening to the so-called tape of tapes, on which Nixon could be heard listening to and commenting on earlier tapes. It's likely Clinton made no recordings when she reviewed her own emails and deleted half of them.
Well, I'm not a crook.
I will do my part to provide transparency to Americans.
Political cartoonists are also finding the comparison irresistible, yet the outside the cartoon panel thinker will ask whether Mrs. Clinton shouldn't aspire to be compared to Mr. Nixon. And Nixon's 2 presidential victories, one a historic landslide, offer the only modern precedent for what Hillary Clinton is attempting, namely to capture the White House after a highly polarizing 20-year career on the national stage. Evan Thomas is the author of the studiously even-handed new biography, Being Nixon.
I don't think that Hillary Clinton is Richard Nixon, but she has some of the same problems. And the biggest problem is that she hides things. She's secretive. That's her nature. It was Nixon's nature.
Clinton supporters note she hasn't been charged by the authorities with committing any crimes, but the controversy over her emails and the finances of the Clinton Foundation have taken a heavy toll on her poll numbers, particularly for honesty and trustworthiness. Shannon?
James Rosen live. Thank you so much, James.
All right, David, let's look at Watergate. You got a third-rate burglary. You got cover-up afterwards that leads to one president leaving office, others going to jail in that particular case. As you see these facts unfolding, as you read these memos, and in the case of Devin Nunes in the House Intel Committee, this is one of at least 5, and you read the Grassley-Graham memo, what are you thinking about in terms of the law and about the comparisons to Watergate?
Well, one thing that strikes me, Sean, is that during Watergate, you had certain key players in the Republican Party, Nixon and others, who thought they could do things, and they had low-level operatives tasking out these things. Now what we have today is an entire radicalized Democratic leftist party that was in control. Obama was virtually immune from everything he did. He had no accountability. And we had him politicizing literally every agency that he thought was important. The IRS, we know what he did with the IRS, turning it on his political opponents or our lowest learner, whatever. They're all doing Obama's bidding. And what they did with the FBI and the DOJ, we know since the time of Clinton they've been staffing these agencies, the DOJ, the FBI, with political operatives who care more about advancing the liberal agenda than they do the rule of law. And so we're seeing this, an upside-down situation where now there's an investigation of Donald Trump for something that didn't even occur. And I'm not suggesting, I'm not going to go so far as to suggest
let me ask you,
the
what should happen from here?
Well, I think that what I hope happens is that we have a counter-investigation, that someone either appoints a special counsel or that the DOJ starts to investigate what was going on during the Obama reign, because they were protecting Hillary. They tried to influence an election. It's always the left always projects, as Devin Nunes says. What they accuse you of, they were doing. They tried to affect the outcome of the election, and it is very corrupt all the way through what they were doing.
And they thought they knew better. They helped Hillary stay in the game. They covered up, and then they advanced all this phony crap to the American people and then used it as a FISA warrant. What should happen? We got 30 seconds each for you guys. How should we proceed, Greg?
Got to be a second special counsel to investigate the investigators. They cleared Hillary Clinton when they knew she had likely committed crimes, and then
there's no doubt she committed crimes.
Conjured up a phony investigation without any evidence, without any indication of a crime being committed, to frame Donald Trump for something he did not do. You have to have a second special counsel.
I think within the next 60 days, you're going to see the Inspector General who's been looking at this for a year. They've been quiet.
You trust him?
I do trust him. He sat with myself and Trey Gowdy. Trey and I both believe wholeheartedly in Michael Horowitz, 450 employees. I also think you're going to need to get rid of the Attorney General. He can't do his job. He's recused out of the most important thing that he's supposed to be doing.
We wouldn't have been here if he didn't recuse.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all. We appreciate it. All right. We have more breaking news tonight. Ed Henry, an exclusive report about a top Democrat's communication with a lobbyist for a Russian oligarch, and the latest on Uranium One. Straight ahead.
I know I should answer the question that is on very many of your minds, and that is, how did a nice Republican girl from Park Ridge go wrong? I mean, this is one of the great unanswered questions that we have to address. And I have to tell you, it started right here. And the reason it did is because in 1964, during the presidential election of that year, I had the absolutely best teachers for what we used to then call, I think, civics and democracy or government and democracy. Each was a semester course. And they decided they were going to have a mock election. And that we were really going to go all out. We were going to have debates. We were going to have the whole panoply of activities around a mock election. At that time, as Ken Reese has told every reporter in America who has called to ask him, and I understand he runs a one-man information bureau about me, I was a Goldwater girl. I mean, really, we used to wear, you know, little banners which said Goldwater girl. So my social studies teachers struck upon this great idea, since I was vocally a Republican and for Senator Goldwater, and one of my very best friends, a woman named Ellen Press, was one of the few Democrats in the whole school, vocally for Lyndon Johnson. Our social studies teacher said, well, we're going to have a debate, but here's what we're going to do. Hillary, you're going to be Lyndon Johnson. Ellen, you're going to be Barry Goldwater. Both of us went ballistic. I said, I can't do that. They said, oh, yes, you will. And you will now go to the library and you will now read about the other side of everything that you have refused to look at for your entire life. And made Ellen do the very same thing. We, with our teeth gritted, then engaged in a mock debate. It was the beginning of what an education should do. People will end up in different ways, but at least we were forced to actually examine deeply what we believed. We were forced to read opinions that were not the ones that we had already formed. So after leaving Maine South, I went to Wellesley, still a Republican, but a different kind of attitude and a different sort of inquiry about what it was I believed. And then gradually over time in college and law school, I evolved my own political beliefs, which frankly are in some ways neither easily defined. They're not dogmatically Republican, dogmatically Democrat, easily defined as liberal or conservative, because again, I believe that thanks to my parents and my teachers, I was always asked those hard questions. Why do you believe this? What's the point? What's the basis? And that's the attitude I still take into our political activities today.